Picture two women. The first is a laborer's daughter from a small town in England, widowed young, working as a seamstress in one of the poorest, most disease-ridden slums in New York City. She owns essentially nothing. The second lives in a brownstone mansion on Fifth Avenue, one of the most fashionable addresses in America, with a staff of servants and her own horse-drawn carriages. Newspapers call her a monster. Society women cross the street to avoid being seen near her house. And she is, by the time she dies, one of the wealthiest women in New York. These are the same woman. Her name was Ann Trow, and almost nobody in 1870s New York knew her by that name at all. They knew her by the one she invented for herself, Madame Restell. Anne was born around 1811 in Gloucestershire, England, the only daughter of a laborer. She emigrated to New York in her late teens with her first husband, a tailor with a serious drinking problem. When he died a few years later, she was left alone in 5 Points, one of the most notorious, overcrowded slums in 19th century America, working as a seamstress to survive. It was there that she met a local practitioner who taught her something that would completely change the direction of her life: how to formulate and sell medicines that prevented pregnancy, and how to perform the procedures that ended one. In 1836, she married a man named Charles Lohman, a compositor at a New York newspaper who shared her interest in the business and its politics, having written in support of limiting family size at a time when large, unplanned families routinely pushed working-class households into poverty. Together, they invented Madame Restell, a supposedly French, supposedly expert female physician, a persona built almost entirely out of thin air by an English immigrant seamstress who had never set foot in France in her life. The fictional French pedigree wasn't incidental. In an era when American medicine was still overwhelmingly the province of men, a foreign-sounding, vaguely aristocratic female professor of midwifery carried an air of authority an ordinary immigrant seamstress never could have claimed under her own name. The business took off almost immediately. Restell began advertising directly in New York newspapers, remarkably openly for the era, offering preventive powders for married women whose health, as the ads delicately put it, forbids a too rapid increase of family. Word spread. Her practice expanded into surgical procedures, housing for unmarried pregnant women, and a mail order operation with satellite offices reaching as far as Philadelphia and Boston. And this is the detail the outraged newspapers of the era conveniently left out of most of their coverage. Restell's clientele wasn't drawn from the desperate poor of 5 Points where she had started. It stretched, by her own later correspondence, across the entire country, and it was disproportionately wealthy. Letters requesting her services and her medicines arrived at her Fifth Avenue address from women whose social standing depended entirely on nobody finding out they'd ever needed to write that letter. If a woman publicly branded a monster in human shape, turning out to be the confidential, quietly patronized secret of the very society that condemned her, is the kind of contradiction you didn't expect from 19th century New York, take a second and hit that like button. It tells me these are the hypocrisies worth dragging back into the light. And subscribe, because how her story ended and who finally brought it to an end is a story about power in its own right. Stay with me. Restell's fortune grew for decades, weathering repeated brushes with the law. In 1841, She stood trial after a patient's deathbed confession implicated her. The conviction was overturned on appeal. In 1847, she was convicted on a lesser charge and spent a year imprisoned on Blackwell's Island. And even that barely slowed her down. While she served her sentence, her husband published a best-selling medical guide under a pen name, keeping the business and the income running. By the time she walked free, she had already quietly promised to give up the surgical side of the practice entirely, shifting her business toward the mail-order medicines and a boarding house for pregnant women instead. A narrower operation, perhaps, but still, for the era, an enormously profitable one. By the 1870s, Restell was living in the mansion that made her infamous, a lavish Fifth Avenue brownstone that New Yorkers pointed at as a monument to vice, even as some of those same New Yorkers, or people exactly like them, quietly used her services. Newspapers of the day reached for extraordinary language to describe her. One physician wrote that lechery and lust paid tribute to her pretensions, and a persistent, almost certainly false rumor circulated that she burned evidence of her work in a furnace beneath the house. None of it dented her income. Her final downfall came from a man who had built his own career hunting people like her, Anthony Comstock, the anti-vice crusader whose name would eventually attach itself to an entire body of federal law. In January of 1878, Comstock went to Restell's mansion, posing as an ordinary customer, purchased contraceptives from her directly, and used that purchase to obtain a search warrant. Weeks later, he returned with police, searched the house, and found pills, powders, and printed material he considered obscene. She was arrested, briefly jailed, and indicted. One final case against a woman by then in her mid-60s, in a career full of them. She never stood trial. On the morning her case was set to be heard, in early April of 1878, Ann Lohman, Madame Restell, was found dead in her bathtub, having taken her own life with a carving knife. She was in her mid-60s. Her estate, the fortune built across 4 decades from a business the century, alternately used in secret and condemned in public, was worth several $100,000, an extraordinary sum for the era, left in the end to her family. The laborer's daughter from Gloucestershire became one of the richest women on Fifth Avenue, hated loudly by a city that quietly kept knocking on her door. Both of those things were true about the same woman at the same time for most of her life. New York, in the 19th century, never really decided which version of Madame Restell it actually believed. It just decided, eventually, which one it was willing to punish. If you want more stories like this one, real, forgotten, hidden in the details the official version leaves out, watch the video already coming up on your screen right now. Here on It Sounds Like Fiction, but it's history, there's always one more secret waiting.